Hello and welcome to No Filter. I'm Mia Friedman. Have you ever sat down in front of The Bachelor or The Bachelorette or even Bachelor in Paradise and thought, why on earth do people go on this show? I have, so many times. Have you ever wondered what goes on behind the scenes in the Bachelor Mansion? What the audition process is like? What it's like being filmed daily? How much everyone gets paid? How involved the producers really are in manipulating the contestants? If the answer to any of those questions is yes, well good, because my guest today knows all that and more, and she's going to pull back the curtain on how this pop culture Bachelor juggernaut of a franchise actually works.
One executive producer told me that he would go to his team and say, like, whoever catches a girl puking on camera, $100. You get a girl crying about The Bachelor, $100. You get these two people to hook up, $100.
Amy Kaufman is an LA Times reporter. She writes a lot about TV, film and pop culture, and she's even been responsible for writing some fantastic exposés of some of the Hollywood power players who have been accused of sexually harassing and abusing women, including James Franco and Brett Ratner. But in her spare time, like many of us, Amy likes to sit around with her girlfriends and watch The Bachelor. But unlike many of us, she decided to write an entire book about it. Over the 2 years she spent researching her book, which is called Bachelor Nation, Amy spoke to ex-contestants, ex-producers, bachelors and bachelorettes about what goes on behind the scenes in one of the world's most popular and prolific social experiments. It's an absolutely fascinating look at how the Bachelor sausage is made. All the questions you've ever asked while watching the show, drinking wine and then reading the Mamma Mia recaps are about to be answered. Here is Amy Kaufman. Amy, congratulations on the book, Bachelor Nation. Inside the world of America's favourite guilty pleasure is like the subtitle of your book. And I wanted to ask you about the guilty and the pleasure.
Well, there's, many pleasure. I would say, more pleasurable aspects for me than guilty ones, obviously, or I wouldn't, still be watching it after all these years. The main one is that it's just a fun thing to do with my friends every week. It's like such a ritual now where my girlfriends come over and it's a good time to hang out. And we're watching The Bachelor, but it's almost not even about that. It's just sort of a social gathering. And then, the hard part to admit is that it is pleasurable to sort of sit on your couch and act a little bit like high and mighty and judge people and these outlandish characters on television. And then the part I really do love at the end, which is so embarrassing, is that I get sucked into the stupid love story and I'm definitely rooting for them by the final episode, even if it's just for that final episode. And then I kind of, I'm on to the next. It's like, it feels good to watch two people be in love, or pretend to be at least.
And what about the guilty? Speak to me of the guilty. Why do you think, what does that speak to? Is it about feminism?
Yeah, partially. I feel guilty that I am like complicit in watching a show where women are depicted in mostly one way, and that they mostly look white and really young and skinny and have super long hair and whatever. And I feel like by watching, I'm just contributing to the idea that that is what a woman needs to be like to be lovable. I don't know. And then I feel guilty that I get so judgmental. I think that's like, it can become like a sport when you're sitting with your friends and someone's like, ugh, why would she say that? Oh my God, she sucks, da da da. And you just are saying things before you even know if you mean them, just like insulting people because they don't feel like real people. Do you watch the show?
Yeah, no, absolutely I do. I started off not, because I started off appalled by the concept from a feminist point of view. And then once the recap started and I started to see that you could kind of look at it through I guess it gave me permission to watch it in a slightly different way. And by not taking it seriously, it felt a little less of a throwback. There was a great headline in The Onion that said something like, "Woman takes brief respite from feminism to enjoy 2 hours of pop culture," or 2 hours of her favorite TV show. And I felt like it was almost that. You had to sort of go, okay, yes, there are 25 skinny young white women competing for the love of a man who's not even that great. What message is that giving to women? And then you just go, okay, you can just get into the cheese of it. But then you're right, also kind of start rooting for the relationships.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, writing this book and like talking about the show so much, I've really come to think about it even more. And people are like, how can you still watch this after everything you know? And I definitely oscillate between feeling like, ugh, you guys stop. It's just The Bachelor. Like, can I live? Who cares? There's so many worse things I could be doing. And then, thinking about like how something that seems so light and fluffy and just, oh, it's just reality TV is like, if you watch the Bachelor finale in the US this year, it was 5 hours over 2 nights. So it's like, that's such a big part of our lives when you add up all these shows we're watching. And I think they impact us a lot more than we want to admit.
Speaking of a large part of your life, you started by doing recaps. You're a reporter at the LA Times and you're a serious reporter. And how did this book come about?
I think as a journalist, there's always this like, it's like, well, what do you do next? Like, are you going to write a book? Everyone always talks about that. And that's sort of like what journalists do to give them, the next step, I guess.
Yeah.
I was like, well, I don't know if I know anything. What do I know enough about or care enough about? And, they always say like, write what you know. And I was like, well, damn it. I guess I tragically, I know The Bachelor. I didn't really know it. I just was intrigued by it and thought there were a lot of interesting questions it raised. And I just really started with the starting point of what we're talking about. Like, why am I so obsessed with this? Why do I feel bad about it? Why do all of my friends who look nothing like the women on the show in terms of both physically and just like what they want out of love and romance, why are we all watching a show that is so opposite of what we claim we believe in? And that was really what sent me down the path of thinking, okay, this is a worthy exploration.
How did you start writing the recaps and how did you go from sort of falling out with the show itself?
Yeah, I mean, as you said, I cover entertainment and film is really my beat at the LA Times, which includes business and film business and stuff like that too. And so the Bachelor recaps were just something fun for me. I was just doing it almost as a favor to the TV staff. I was like, well, I'm watching this anyway. And it's my chance to kind of be opinionated and snarky and a different type of voice. And as a result of doing that, you get invited to, reunion tapings or to like interview Chris Harrison, who's the host and stuff like that. And so I was in good with them for, I would say, 4 or 5 years. And suddenly one year I stopped getting invited to that stuff. And I thought that was odd, obviously. And we reached out to see what was going on. And my television editor was told that my recaps were too negative. And so they didn't want me near the franchise, basically. And so I don't know if it was a swift reaction. My editor was like, well, forget them. We're not writing with The Bachelor anymore. And we did that for a while, but now we cover it again in a critical way, of course, or at least a fully balanced way, I would say.
And so that's when you decided that there was a phenomenon here worth exploring.
I definitely thought like, well, what are they hiding? And I'm really not even saying anything what I consider to be that bad. I'm just making fun of the stupid dates or whatever. Like, why are they so sensitive? And because a lot of my friends are journalists, a lot of the people who are on the show would like interact with us on Twitter and stuff. And we'd invite some of them over to our houses for our viewing parties. And it was really like through talking to them that when they were candid about what they'd gone through on the show, I was like, oh my God, some of these experiences are so crazy. And if people would be willing to open up about them, I think there would definitely be an interest from readers in wanting to hear about it.
So your book is incredibly well researched. You interviewed dozens and dozens of people, former contestants, producers, all kinds of people associated with the show. Some of them would go on the record, some of them wouldn't. Some of them were scared because of confidentiality contracts that they'd signed, which we'll get to in a moment. But I wanted to start with, why would anyone go on this show?
Yeah, I've heard that a million times. Yeah. What most people told me who did it was that they thought it would be a fun adventure. They thought they would get to travel the world, and some were less forthcoming about this, but obviously become a little bit famous, right? Like get an outlet to make more money in some way through club appearances, through Instagram ads, something like that. And then if they met a guy along the way, that was just sort of like an added bonus. And I think, a lot of people told me that in retrospect, they realized they weren't in great places in their lives. Like they either wanted a jump start in some way, or they weren't happy in their job, or, they'd just been broken up with, something that made them feel like, let me do something crazy.
It didn't always start out that way though, did it? Because in America, you're up to about season 33 or 35. of The Bachelor. So it's been going for around 20 years. I remember when I first got started in journalism, you know, probably over 20 years ago, 25 years ago, I remember like Trista and Ryan, was it Ryan?
Yep, Ryan.
And those early days. That was before social media. So there wasn't the lure of, you know, endorsements for Flat Tummy Tea or starting your own cocktail line of tequilas. But fame and fortune, has that become more of a motivating factor for people to get involved? At the beginning, it was a little bit more idealistic that people were looking for love, or has fame always been a big part of it?
Yeah, I in the book I said, you know, the first American Bachelor was named Alex Michel, and he at the time was considering going on Survivor. So, I mean, clearly, like, you know, these people are figuring there's something in it for them. Back then, it might have been being a television host or something. Who knows what it would have led to. But yeah, initially it was really hard for them to find, especially the contestants. Like, will you go on a show and compete with 25 strangers for someone we tell you is eligible? It's like, who the hell is going to sign up for that? Especially when reality television was in really nascent stages. Now, you know, they look in more untraditional routes to find the contestants, because the people who are applying tend to be like more of the fame hoary type, you know, they want like, off LinkedIn or in a bar on the street or something.
Tell me about the application process. What do contestants have to go through to be on The Bachelor?
I mean, it's really involved. So if you end up getting to the finals weekend, which I think is about 100 people, maybe between 50 and 100, and they fly you to LA, and you get put up in like an airport hotel for a weekend, and basically you go through just a series of different interviews and meetings. So you are interviewed by a psychologist. You meet with a private investigator. So they're trying to preempt any tabloid stories that might kind of come out. They'll be like, what's the worst thing someone could sell a story about you on? And then you have to take a blood and urine test to see if you have STDs.
Really?
Yeah, because they hook up so much, they can't really have like the liability of that.
I found that one of the most surprising things in your book about, we'll talk about the herpes.
Yeah, I know. So people think this is funny, but they, like, one of the producers I spoke to told me that he was sort of in his early 20s when he started working on the show, and he was surprised to learn that the number one reason people got rejected was because they had herpes. And he's like, wow, it's much more prevalent than I realized. So yeah, and it's so fun. After this has come out, so many doctors have reached out to me asking what kind of test they use to determine if someone has herpes, because I guess there's a difference in a blood or a urine test, and like herpes is so common that like it's very sensitive. They could pick it up easily. And so I don't know the answer to that, but
well, if you've ever had a cold sore, I imagine you would come up as testing positive for herpes.
Maybe, yeah. And there's like all these articles have been written like, this is just contributing to the stigma, and like this is an unfair, like, you know, rule. Which, I mean, on one hand, yes, but on the other, it's like, I guess they just have to be as careful as humanly possible.
Well, I'm going to jump straight to the hookups, actually, before we get back to the application process, because that is a big difference between the American Bachelor and the Australian Bachelor. There is no sex in the Australian Bachelor. The most there is kissing.
How did that get established?
I don't know. It just was sort of never an option in Australia. I mean, they are very idealistic about the show when you talk to the network, and it is cast pretty differently in Australia to America. So my perception from the outside is that America casts it as a bit of a car crash. So they're looking for girls and guys who are going to get into either fights or have dramas or behave in ways that is going to make great television. Whereas in Australia, they were more literally trying to cast it as this very romantic Prince Charming meets Cinderella, and sex just was never on the table in Australia. There was no fantasy suite. There's never been any sex.
Do they get engaged at the end?
Occasionally, one time they've been engaged. You know, lots of breakups. Like it doesn't have a fantastic. I mean, there's one couple who've just announced their second pregnancy. So I think they're together and they've had a couple of babies. But, you know, there's not a fantastic strike rate, not dissimilar to the US. But for those of us who haven't seen the American show, how the sex works, because America, from my understanding, is certainly on commercial television, a conservative, you know, religious, puritanical a little bit.
Well, certainly on, you know, this show airs on ABC here, which is a huge, you know, corporate network owned by Disney. And so it has to be family friendly. And yeah, it started in the same way you were talking about, where they were selling the Cinderella fairy tale narrative, and ultimately they still do. But they have to walk a fine line of, seeming really chaste, but also being realistic that people want to figure out what it would be like to be together sexually if they were to get engaged, and that seems realistic. So those sort of like, they just insinuate everything. There have been some seasons where it's been racier. I would say the raciest it ever got was like two people straddling one another in a hot tub, but they had, bathing suits on, but it was like very hot and heavy. But usually what we see is just some kissing, the door close, and then we hear, like moaning noises. And then the next morning cut to them in a bed, like ordering breakfast in bed kind of thing. And they do that with almost the way the dates are shown. Usually it's almost always all three women that the Bachelor does that with, or all three dudes that the woman does it with. So even if they don't sleep together, which a lot of times they don't sleep with all three, it always looks like they do.
God, so I'm sitting here with my hand over my mouth as if I'm so scandalized, which is just so ridiculous because, yeah, of course, but I'm more anticipating the reaction and the slut shaming, obviously of the women, not ever of the men. But doesn't a lot of that go on?
Going back to the first season, you mentioned Tristan Ryan. That was a big concern. And the host, Chris Harrison, has talked a lot about that, they thought, okay, when a woman does this, she's going to be called a slut. Obviously, it's fine for the guy to do it, but for a woman, is America going to be okay with that? And so she really went to pains in her season to say, like, listen, if I'm going to be with this guy as my husband, I need to figure out if we're compatible. And people went along with that. And there have been women and men who have had religious beliefs and make it very clear, I'm just going here to talk with you. I don't want to, spend the night with you. Mm. But yeah, the double standard has reared its ugly head. At one point, a woman decided to sleep with a guy. Her name was Caitlin. She decided to sleep with one of her contestants prior to the fantasy suite, which was like, oh my God, she slept with someone not in the designated sex room before the designated sex time. It was like, and then she had to she had this chat with Chris Harrison where she sort of said she felt guilty, and he was like, well, good, at least you feel guilty. And it's like,
oh my God, slut shamed by the host. So there is a designated sexy time in the fantasy suite when it gets down to the final three.
Yes, exactly.
But you meant to keep it in your pants before then.
Right. And which is weird because, like, what's the difference between 5 weeks or 6 weeks or something?
So back to the application process at the airport hotel, razzle dazzle, so Hollywood. When they're having all those interviews and you mentioned in the book, they talk to the psychologist, they talk to a private investigator, they have one-on-ones with the producer, and then they have this like lightning round where they're brought in and there's like 24 producers sitting sort of stadium style in front of them that just pepper them with different questions.
Yeah.
Are they actually looking for people who are a little bit unhinged? Because that makes better television, right?
I mean, one of the producers I'd interviewed who had been through that experience said that, they all pass these tests that say they're not, quote unquote, crazy, that they're like mentally stable. But there's like, he said, a window of the pass. So like you want them to be out there and crazy, but not mental issues crazy, which is a difficult, I don't know how you discern that exactly. But what he was saying is like, he gave the example of, you just want someone who is more, I guess, unfiltered. So if you were talking about, your last boyfriend, he was saying you'd want someone who was like, yeah, my last boyfriend was really cute, great guy, my parents loved him, versus someone who says, oh my God, my last boyfriend was like so hot and we hooked up, we like had sex in the pool, my parents hated him and like I didn't care. Like you want that girl rather than the more boring girl.
Because what's unspoken, or perhaps spoken certainly since we've seen the TV show Unreal, which was produced by a former Bachelor producer of 9 seasons, Sarah
Gertrude Shapiro.
In season 2 or season 1 of that, one of the contestants commits suicide. And obviously that is not good for the show. It's not good for people. So they don't want that level of mental health problems. But as you say, they do want someone who's quite, or people who are quite performative, because that's going to make better television than people just saying, oh, I really like him.
And it's hard. I mean, there was a woman who unfortunately did commit suicide after pretty shortly after she was on television. And there was no direct correlation, so you never know. But it's tricky. There was one woman I spoke to in the book who said she was pretty open about the fact with the psychologist that she had struggled with depression throughout her life, and that at that point, well, she wasn't depressed, but that she had a tendency towards it, and the therapist didn't seem to find an issue with that. And she was like, well, upon reflection, if I'm someone who gets depressed and I'm going to be in this crazy situation that's sure to stir up a lot of feelings, shouldn't they have been a little bit more cautious?
So you sail through the application process. You get chosen as one of the lucky 25 that gets to compete for the love of one fairly average guy in most cases. Right. What happens next? You get sent a contract, and you actually got hold of a contract, which was pretty breathtaking.
Yeah, I mean, the contracts are stunning in how intense they are. And I mean, frankly, once you read it, you're like, literally, though, who would sign up for this? I mean, the conceit of the show is already pretty out there. And then once you read that, in all capital letters, it says, you agree to be ridiculed, to be manipulated, to be misrepresented, to be edited, that if you have no privacy, they can film you at all times. And if they catch you naked, they own that footage. It's like, why would you agree to that?
And it even says, as you say, you've got that clause in capital letters, and it says, I understand, acknowledge and agree that producers may use or reveal personal information which may be embarrassing, unfavorable, shocking, humiliating, disparaging and or derogatory, may subject me to public ridicule and or condemnation, and may portray me in a false light.
Right. It's like you can't get more crystal clear about all the negative potential ramifications, and yet people just don't think it's going to happen to them.
So they sign up, they come to film the show. Where is the show filmed?
It is filmed, well, it starts out in a mansion in Agora Hills, California, which is sort of like near where the Kardashians live. And then they start traveling the world.
What happens to them when they get there? All their devices are removed from them, and then they enter what you describe as the bubble. What's it like inside the bubble?
That was the biggest thing that I got a better sense of after researching the book, was when, we're watching and we see people saying, I love you so quickly, or agreeing to get engaged after such a short period of time. It's all because of the bubble. And I was like, oh, okay, I get it now. So basically, yeah, as you said, people get there. You can't have any electronic devices. So no phone, no internet, no books, really, no television, no music. You have an open bar at your disposal. Everyone there is talking about how great Joe Schmo is. And then all the producers are around being like, isn't Joe Schmo great? Like, oh my God, he's everything you've always wanted, da 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 da. And so you start thinking, okay, Joe Schmo is the cat's meow and you've nothing else to think about. So you get a little turned upside down.
Tell me about the relationship between the producers and the contestants. We've obviously, with the TV show Unreal, which is just so brilliant in terms of looking how the sausage is made, as your book's like the documentary version, that's the dramatized version. We get a little bit of an insight into the relationship between producers and contestants. What did you learn in reporting out your book?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very tricky relationship. And so many contestants during the process really come to trust the producers. They call them their best friends. They, at turns, have called them their therapists even, because they feel like, they forget that these people are doing jobs and have an entertaining television show to make. They just feel like, wow, this person is really letting me confide in them, and perhaps even sharing their own personal details, even though those personal details will not be broadcast on national television. And the way they get to know each other mostly happens during what are called ITMs. It's in the moment interviews. So that's like those one-on-one things where we just see sort of a talking head, a girl talking about her feelings for The Bachelor or something. And those happen one-on-one with the producer, and you feel like you're just sitting alone with them, even though there's, crew around you or whatever. And it might be at the end of a long day where you're a little bit tipsy already, or you're certainly tired, and they're asking you, do you think you're in love with The Bachelor? And you're like, well, I don't know. It's only been just a few weeks. I'm not there yet. And they're like, okay, well, every other girl has said that they're in love with The Bachelor. And I know that in your last relationship, it was your lack of emotional vulnerability that really caused things to break down. So I feel like The Bachelor really needs to hear this from you, and then you're like, well, I'm still not ready. And then they just keep peppering you and hammering you. And like eventually you sort of give in.
Some of the girls said to you they were often almost given lines to say.
Yeah. People always ask, is the show scripted? Is it fake? It's not scripted, but yes, they will ask you certain leading questions or suggest you say things. You don't have to, but you're so, as we were talking about, like in this environment where you feel like you do, even though you don't.
What about the producers being given money to elicit particularly good or bad behavior out of the contestants?
Yeah, this is a practice that I'm not sure still goes on, but in the early years certainly did, where, one executive producer told me that before the night would begin of filming, he would go to his team and say, like, all right, guys, we need some good stuff tonight. So whoever catches a girl puking on camera, $100. You get a girl crying about The Bachelor, $100. You get these two people to hook up, $100. And so these staffers aren't necessarily making a ton of bank. And so $100 in cash is like a good incentive for them.
And they even track the girls' periods. What's that about?
Yeah. I mean, again, this was, I really hope they still don't do this. But basically, living in this house, all the women's periods start to sync up. And so producers catch wind of that and would schedule interviews when these girls would be PMSing so that they would be like particularly emotional and more inclined to give the juicy sound bites.
Hello, I am Rachel Corbett, and if you have any little ears listening to this, I'd probably send them outside for a second because I've got something important to tell you. We are dropping a brand new show, and it is all about sex. The show is called Sealed Section, and it is sex chat you wish you could have with your girlfriends. All your sexual conundrums will be dissected by Australia's highest paid escort, Samantha X.
I did shag my Uber driver the other day. I shagged him in the back of the car.
I hope she gave him a 5-star rating. And the scholar of all things sexuality, Dr. Lauren Rosewarne.
The devil enters you when you're masturbating at the point of orgasm. I really think that you've missed the mark if you're thinking that's a turn off.
And I'll be there too, just holding on for dear life. Mamma Mia's Sealed Section is coming soon, so be the first to know when it drops by subscribing in Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to this show.
It all looks very glamorous in the mansion from the outside, certainly the parts that we see. What are living conditions actually like there for the girls?
Yeah, I don't know how it is in Australia, but here, from the outside, it's like you pull up in a limo to this like stucco style mansion, and the driveway is all watered down and glistening. And inside, while there are certainly nice rooms, it's a nice house, you are sleeping upstairs in rooms that they've brought in bunk beds. You're all sharing a room. They leave the lights on all night until like 4 a.m. You're sharing like 1 or 2 bathrooms. You all have luggage and it's spread all over the floor. And, it's not like some plush, amazing bed or something. Although there obviously are perks, like any food you want, any alcohol you want, PAs will go get it for you. You do cook for yourself, though.
That idea of boredom as well, and taking away, particularly in this digital age, everybody's crutches. Like if there's literally nothing to do, there's nothing even to read, you can't have magazines or books. What effect does that have on the people inside captivity?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think people think about that, right? Like even being without our phones when's the last time someone went out without their phone for a full day even?
I'm anxious now, and I've just put my phone aside just to talk to you.
Exactly. Just for an hour, right? It's like crazy. And then without any other stimulation, you're forced to talk to people who maybe you don't even like or who are completely different from you, and you're competitive with them. It's like, it's just an environment that is so unique and created to elicit, nutso reactions, basically.
And in terms of the bubble, one of the things that's so great about your book is that your chapters are interspersed with the first-person chapters from, different celebrities and public figures talking about their feelings about The Bachelor. So there's Amy Schumer, and Alison Williams is another one that I was very interested in. She plays Marnie on Girls. And she talks about she talks about the love-hate relationship she has with the show and the way that it does exist in a bubble, not just for the girls, but for the viewers. Like, you never find them talking about politics, for example. You're never going to have them sitting around the mansion talking about Trump.
Right. Yeah, I thought it was interesting coming from Allison because her dad is Brian Williams, who's an American newscaster. So the news is very important to her. But yeah, it's like she was saying, would it kill them to be allowed to talk about, current affairs or who they voted for or whatever. But when you actually think about it, I do understand the logic in terms of the show, because think about even following, like, okay, there's been a flood or some sort of like storm near your hometown. Then you start worrying about your family and like, you know what I mean? Like any sort of distraction would just take you out of it.
And also it takes the viewer out of it, I guess, in terms of these are women with lives and opinions and, that there's stuff going on in the outside world. It's really got to preserve this timeless idea of this romantic bachelor bubble.
Right. I mean, which is, as Allison was saying, I'm sure these women are much more multifaceted than we give them credit for, which is why it's so easy for us to make fun of them, because the edit is only showing them talking about the guy and how great he is and not what their interests may be or their careers.
Amy, how much do you get paid to go on the show?
If you were going on to compete for The Bachelor, you get paid literally nothing.
What do you mean?
You get paid nothing. You don't get a stipend. So not only, as I thought about this after the fact, I realized I should have focused on it a bit more, that it's a very self-selecting process because, first of all, you have to be able to leave your job for up to 8 weeks. While you're gone, you need to be able to cover all of your expenses and bills. And if you're going to go on, you need to probably spend a lot of money on a wardrobe or makeup or, surgery, whatever these people do. Sometimes they go to extreme lengths. And then when you're there, you don't get paid. Sometimes they give you like a free bag of luggage with like some makeup and a bikini in it and stuff. But yeah, you get nada unless you are the actual lead, the Bachelor or the Bachelorette.
Wow. And how much does the Bachelor or the Bachelorette get?
Even that is sort of mysterious. It's based on your salary in the real world. So the last Bachelor in America was a real estate agent. And so how much would he have been making during that time? And what are the bills that he would have to cover? And I'm sure also, it's sort of like an actor with a quote. Like you try to figure out what the last Bachelor made, but it's sort of a secret. But there's been reported figures in tabloids. So it's like all negotiation process.
That's such a good point. And I guess it really feeds into that retro throwback feeling of the whole show and its premise, because the captions giving the occupations of all the girls are almost hilarious in themselves. What are some of the ones that, I mean, they've almost become absurd, different ways of sort of saying unemployed.
People do that there too. Like they just will say like, the ones here that have been nuts have been like twin. Like there were two twin sisters and they just called them twin as their job. There was like one called Waboom because he liked to make the noise waboom a lot. Like that was his sound effect. I mean, this was the first season actually that they went back. Every woman had a real job title, which was stunning. I think they sort of realized, okay, we're like taking this too far with the tongue-in-cheek thing. Even the people who do tend to, like, I remember one guy was actually a singer-songwriter and they wrote like Army veteran. Like they play with people's identities, to make them fit a narrative for us.
This also feeds into the lack of diversity on the show. I know that's something that's been talked about in Australia a lot, and I know that it's been an issue in America. How has the diversity issue played out over the different seasons?
So the diversity issue really came to a head, I think it was about 5 years ago now, in 2012. I'm not sure exactly, but two African-American men who had applied to be on the show and were not accepted, filed a lawsuit saying that was discriminatory and that basically they weren't cast because of their race. And the lawsuit was thrown out, but it still got a lot of media attention and basically raised all of these people started writing think pieces and saying like, well, why aren't there more people of different races on this show? Why haven't we had a person of color in the lead? Then we did get a Black Bachelorette as our last Bachelorette, Rachel, But even from that, we went right back to a white bachelor. So, they're trying to diversify, but it's incredibly slow. And it's so far, it's only been in skin color, not in body type or, like sexual orientation, or the show does not at all reflect what America is comprised of.
And Amy Schumer talks about that in her piece in your book, about how she was once approached to be a bachelorette, and she thought about it in terms of, wouldn't it be great just because her body type does not conform to the standard, bachelor body type for women, which is universally skinny, big boobs, tall, and surely that's not good for women either, is it? Is that also part of the guilty pleasure, that we know that what we're looking at, it's almost like flipping through a fashion magazine. It's not reflective of the female population.
Right. Even fashion magazines, honestly, have progressed at a faster rate. They have plus size models. I mean, I think there was one plus size model. Of course, if there's a girl who's curvy on the show, she has to be a plus size model. She couldn't just be a little bit chubby. But yeah, Amy Schumer was saying she would have loved to do it just to lay by the pool in her bathing suit and be like, yep, guys, I have cellulite. We're all worthy of love. Accept it. It would have been great.
What's the relationship between feminism and The Bachelor in your experience?
I mean, that's the number one question. And there have been so many articles I'm sure you've read of how can you be a feminist and watch this show? And then people try to twist themselves into pretzels to explain that answer. And I think ultimately we're just not necessarily, like you said, it's just 2 hours where we don't have to think that way. And if you were trying, one of the scholars I interviewed in the book said if you were trying to go through the world where everything you consume was a reflection of your ideals, that wouldn't be possible. You couldn't go to Target. You couldn't eat at certain restaurants, because you'd be breaking those beliefs all the time. And also, when men start worrying about watching football and how that, impacts their worldview, then maybe, why are we the only ones worrying about our beliefs in this way? But, also feminists can be into love and romance. What is, the two are not mutually exclusive.
But then I guess you break it down and you go, how romantic is it actually being one of 25 women dating a guy at the same time?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's not what I find romantic, but I mean, everyone's well, why would this was interesting. In one of the essays, the screenwriter Diablo Cody says that she admits she likes watching it because she feels superior to the people on the show, and she can be okay, girl who has no bigger dream than to move to a farm and raise children. I'm an Oscar-winning screenwriter, and one of the contestants told me she read that and was wow, that's, for someone who proclaims to be a feminist, that's actually very anti-feminist. What if that's what I want in life? I think, because we've been taught we can have the world, going back to sort of this baseline traditional, if all you want, quote unquote, all you want is just a husband and kids, there's something wrong with that. And I think part of watching The Bachelor and the interest in it is showing that we do still want those things. And maybe we just need to roll back the judgment on women who are that open about their desire for it.
I wanted to ask you how the show's changed over the seasons. It's been a long time, as I said, over 20 years since The Bachelor started in the US and is now in, probably most countries in the world. But the world has changed a lot in that time. Tinder, for example, and the way people date online, ideas about sexuality, ideas about sex. How has the show evolved beyond the initial concept with the roses, the ideas? Has it, and does it need to, do you think?
I think it needs to. I think one of the more interesting things to watch has been what the definition of an eligible guy or woman, but really more the guy, frankly, on The Bachelor is. Because when it started, this guy was literally Harvard and Stanford educated, worked at a big finance consulting group, was from a very affluent suburb. He was on paper checked all of those boxes. And that was what kind of women wanted at the time, or what at least obviously the producers of the show thought they wanted. And then over time, they had a prince, a low level prince. They had a professional athlete, all these people with quote unquote status. And now it's sort of just a really nice guy who maybe believes in Jesus and just sells software. And in some ways, I think that's reflective of what women are looking for on, like, I like it in some ways because I'm like, okay, it's about more than just superficial check boxes. But on the other hand, I'm like, are we settling? Are we just like, you can still, the guy should have something to offer. What the hell?
So true. What do you think about the show Unreal? What impact has that had on the way we watch The Bachelor?
I mean, I don't think it's had a huge effect, which is crazy. I love the show Unreal, and it got me definitely thinking about writing this book because I wanted to know what was real and what wasn't. But I don't think people like stop watching The Bachelor because of Unreal, and I don't think people will stop watching The Bachelor because of my book, which was not my intention, certainly. I just want people to be more mindful of what they're watching. And, I think maybe the two, Unreal and my book and all the sort of stories that are out there about production and how it works, do get people to think, okay, well, I would hope to get people to think the characters we're being sold on television are altered. They're not, like, take this with a grain of salt, and maybe stop saying such harsh things about them because it's all toyed with a little bit. On the other hand, I sort of feel like now you have no excuse if you sign up for it, not knowing what you're getting into, sort of. It's like, that you're signing that crazy contract and that many people have not been happy with their depictions. So in some ways, I feel like if you sign the dotted line, I have a little bit less sympathy for you in the end if you're not happy with the experience.
Do most people regret going on? You spoke to a lot of former contestants.
I mean, there are plenty of people who enjoyed their experience, I think, and yes, a lot of those people it led to business opportunities for. So I get that. But yeah, there's been plenty of people who made friends out of it, or do feel like it was a crazy experience that they'll get to tell their grandkids about one day. But for those who saw their reputations actually very damaged by it, or even had a tough time, I think people underestimate how difficult it will be to get a taste of, like, quote unquote, the good life and then go back to your 9 to 5. I think that's a much harder adjustment than most people understand.
And what about the ones who were portrayed as villains?
That was an interesting mix because some of those people said, they had no idea it was going to go down that way. They got home and everyone thought they were these terrible people. And then other people went in being like, oh yeah, I was complicit in that. I played up that image. Like, I knew they were going for that. And so I thought, okay, I'll get more airtime if I do this, which those kind of people baffle me.
God.
Yeah. It's like, why would you say something crazy just to be on TV more so more people can hate you? I don't get that.
And surely that's not, part of the lucrative side business of being a former reality show contestant, or perhaps it is. Perhaps there are endorsement deals that are available for villains.
Oh, yeah, there are. There's villains who are making bank, too. But there's always, I feel like, some inevitable, like, next reality show career or some arc somewhere where they realize that's not really who they are and whatever.
I wanted to ask you about your work around the Me Too reporting. You've done 3 incredible groundbreaking pieces. One exposing Brett Ratner, the second was around Russell Simmons, and the third was James Franco. What's it been like in your world during this whole last 6 months of Me Too?
It's been pretty crazy. When Harvey first happened, I think none of us understood just how big this situation was going to get. And certainly as a reporter, it was like, well, are people ready to talk about this now? Is there a different standard and precedent that's been set? And I think there was sort of like this feeling, certainly from editors, but even just from people in Hollywood of like, well, what's there to be scared of now? Like, everyone's shared these stories about Harvey. Like, what's the problem? And it's like, you guys have no idea how difficult it is for women to open up, men to open up about these stories, about the fear. There's a huge fear of legal ramifications. It's also not like you just share this story and you're done. It was an educational process for me, just learning how much people go through to get their stories out there.
What was it like as a reporter? I mean, you're not a psychologist, you're not a lawyer, you're not a counsellor, and yet you were in this position of talking to women about some of the most traumatic experiences of their lives. How did you handle that?
That was like one of the hardest. I mean, clearly my emotional state is nothing compared to what they had to go through, but On the Ratner story in particular, that was the first one I was really thrown into. And I feel like I'm going to be connected to some of those women for life just because of how much they felt like they were trusting me and sharing with me, and what a responsibility I felt in conveying their story fairly and accurately. And then to see, you know, some of the women go on to be their names to be smeared through the mud by these people. And one woman even has been sued by Brett Ratner. It's challenging. And I don't feel like a therapist, like you're saying. It's like people are sharing these stories and I just try to be sympathetic and listen. And I always worry that I'm not doing a good enough job.
Do you feel like the momentum has slowed, or that women are now more cautious or less cautious, or do you feel like the worst monsters have been unmasked? How are you feeling about it now?
I think it's natural that kind of pace couldn't have kept up. And I pray that all of the worst stories have been exposed, but who knows, you know, like as we were just talking about, people think it's easy to talk about now because there's more stories like this. Maybe it is a little easier, but everyone has a different experience, and the fear of litigation is really real. And I think we still have yet to see, here we have what's called the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund. I know that hasn't expanded internationally yet.
No, we have the same thing here. It's called Now Australia.
Oh, nice. So it's a separate entity.
Yes.
Right. I think I meant Time's Up was trying to distribute some of their funds internationally, but hasn't yet. But yeah, you know, so even them, they haven't figured out how they're going to distribute them, how they make those decisions with all the calls that are coming in. And when you call, it's not like you automatically get protection. It's like, it's a process and a vetting process. So there are a lot of risks still involved. And I hope that doesn't deter people from wanting to share their story.
Working as you do in the heart of Hollywood at the LA Times and in the entertainment, on the entertainment beat, do you feel like there has been a fundamental change after this reckoning?
In terms of like how business is done in the industry?
Exactly.
That's really like the big question that's remaining, because as we were talking about, you know, all of these, you know, the Legal Defense Fund has been formed, and organizations like the Screen Actors Guild and the Directors Guild and the Academy of Motion Pictures have set all of these guidelines out with they're not going to tolerate things anymore. And yet it remains to be seen if people are comfortable using those outlets. You know, I think there's still a fear that if you like call a hotline or you're the one to report something, that you're branded as the whistleblower sort of. And, you know, what is the due process when you do report something like that? Is someone fired? Are they punished? Or, you know, there's still all these things are being worked out. It's really complicated. And I think this is like where the actual work is going to be done. It's in a way like the easy part already happened in some ways, even though it was incredibly emotional. It's like to create the lasting change to make sure this stuff doesn't happen anymore. That's what's going on right now.
There's been a lot of focus on the women who have broken these stories, or the journalists that have, Rowan Farrow and Megan Twee and you at the LA Times. Have you had personal backlash, or have you felt that you've sort of been thrust into the middle of the story as a reporter?
No, like thankfully, unlike, you know, Ronan Farrow is, and same with, you know, Megan and Jody at the New York Times, they started this whole thing with Harvey. And, you know, when it was revealed how much they had gone through personally and that they had been almost tricked and followed by these agents and all of this, I mean, I was even more impressed with the work they had done because they really, without them, anything I've done wouldn't have been possible. So, you know, there've been moments where I remember after one of these stories happened, my parents were freaking out and were like, you shouldn't walk alone at night. And you like, you know, like you should be very cautious. And I was like, you guys stop, you're being ridiculous. And then I heard all the stuff about what had happened to Ronan and how they had been sort of tracked in that way. And I was like, well, you know, don't put anything past someone whose entire career is fundamentally changed now as a result of a story.
You were writing truth to power. I mean, there's some of those men, Brett Ratner and Russell Simmons in particular, are hugely powerful and influential in their industry. So Credit to you, and thank you for the work you do. Thank you for the most wonderful book. Thank you for your Me Too reporting, and I can't wait to see what you do next and keep following your byline. What's the best way to stay across everything that you're doing?
The best way is probably my Twitter, which is Amy K in LA. And thank you so much, Mia, for being so interested and so sweet.
You can find Amy's book at bookstores or at apple.co/Mamma Mia. Even though she writes ostensibly about the American Bachelor, it's still completely relevant to Australia. I love this book, and I'm not even a huge Bachelor fan. I don't watch the show that much. I read our recaps, but yeah, it was just a fascinating book and really, really well researched. No Filter is produced by Eliza Ratliff. I will see you at the homepage on mamamia.com.au.